So hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the 9th day of 2 weeks of Elizabeth Gaskell. Today we're going to be talking about Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Sylvia's Lovers. Chapter 1. Monkshaven. On the north-eastern shores of England there is a town called Monkshaven, containing at the present day about 15,000 inhabitants. There were, however, but half that number at the end of the last century, and it was in that period that the events narrated in the following pages occurred. So Sylvia's Lovers is a novel by Elizabeth Gaskell when it was first published in 1863, and it is my 6th favourite Elizabeth Gaskell novel. I am very fond of Sylvia's Lovers, but I do have to admit that it took me quite a long time to get into it, and it is one of those books that I would recommend you staying with all the way through and not giving up if you're not quite enjoying it in the first half, because I do think, as with a few other Gaskell books, it's one of those books that starts a little bit slow and then gets much more exciting, much more dramatic, and much more engaging the further on you go. It is quite a long one, it's about 200,000 words, it's one of her full-length novels, but it is absolutely worth a read. So, to explain a bit of what Sylvia's Lovers is about, firstly it is a historical novel. It is set quite a while before it was written, and it's set in the 1790s in the fictional town of Monkshaven, which is apparently based on Whitby. The majority of the men in this town work as fishermen. They go out on long whaling expeditions and come back regularly. The majority of men in this town are sailors and naval men, and with an increasing number of naval men needed to fight the French in the French Revolutionary Wars, a lot of pressure is put on the people in Monkshaven. The book deals really interestingly with events of the 1790s, such as the press gangs, where men were effectively abducted and forced into the navy. This aspect of Sylvia's Lovers is really interesting. But Sylvia's Lovers focuses, as you might imagine, on a young woman called Sylvia and two men who are in love with her. One is her friend and distant cousin Philip, who works in a tailor shop, and the other is a rather more dashing and attractive young man who is a sailor called Charles Kinraid. The book follows the lives of Sylvia and her family, and also of these two men who are interested in Sylvia, looks at the development over the course of her life and how the actions of the people around her affect her and how her actions affect them. It's difficult for me to say more about the plot without spoiling it, because it has quite a lot of twists and turns, and it's one of those Gaskell books where you just really have no idea where it's going to go as the book goes on, but it is well worth a read and really engaging. So there are many things about Sylvia's Lovers which I love. For one, I love the historical setting. I find it a really interesting time period, and the way in which Gaskell explores the pressures of fear of war with the French and also fears of the press gang, the way that she looks at how this small seaside town that is so reliant on naval men operates, and also the way she looks at class in this small town and how it can operate quite differently to other towns. I think the way she examines the setting is really good and really effective. I think my favourite character in the book is probably Philip, who I would argue is possibly the main character of the book, more so than Sylvia herself. I'll talk about this in a little bit more in a minute. Philip is such a fascinating character. I don't agree with everything he does. He is very flawed, but you feel for him and you understand him and you appreciate him, and over the course of the book you see him change and grow, and you see the effect of the mistakes he makes on people around him. The book is also a really interesting examination of love and kind of being careful what you wish for, I suppose, and I think Philip is such an interesting character in the way his trajectory is explored. The reason why I love this book so much and why it is not a little bit further down on this list is mainly to do with Philip and what an interesting, fascinating character I find him. I think he is wonderful, and to explore his psychology and his journey over the course of the book is really interesting. I also think there are a lot of brilliant themes in Sylvia's Lovers. One theme I really enjoy in this is to do with education and what people value. Philip, who works in a shop, is educated. He can read and write very well. He cares about business, he cares about education and learning. Sylvia really hates learning, has no interest in knowing how to read or write, doesn't view this as something that is at all important for her life, and Philip makes efforts throughout the book to try and educate her and teach her, which she has no interest in, and this kind of theme of education and whether or not education is worth having is really important and really interesting throughout the book. I also think the book sets up a really interesting kind of conflict between the practical and the emotional, between what is the sensible thing to do and what is the thing you want to do. In the very first chapter, Sylvia goes to buy a cloak and she can't decide whether to buy a sensible, practical grey cloak or to buy a beautiful red cloak that she will really love but won't last as long. And I feel like a lot of the book is kind of set up in these two choices. Sylvia is choosing between Charles Kinraid, the sailor, who is a bit flirtatious, who likes to dance with everyone, who likes to have fun, and who, however much he enjoys Sylvia's company, is a bit less steady than the sensible Philip. And throughout the book you can see characters choosing between what is the sensible thing to do and what is the thing that they are drawn emotionally to do. As with many other Gaskell books, Sylvia's Lovers very interestingly explores grief in a way that I think is really very effective. It also explores issues of morality and truthfulness and the impact of momentary decisions on other people in a way that I think is really interesting. I also just love the plot of Sylvia's Lovers, and it's definitely one of those Gaskell books for me that improves dramatically as it goes on. I found the first half a bit slow and hard to get into, but the more I read, the more I loved it, and by the end of the book I was completely in love with the characters and the world, and I was so thoroughly engaged and so fascinated with what Elizabeth Gaskell was doing. But on that note, I should talk about a few things that I think make Sylvia's Lovers a little bit of a less accessible Gaskell read and a little bit of a less enjoyable Gaskell read potentially. I do think it's well worth a read, but I wouldn't recommend it as a good place to start with Elizabeth Gaskell. One of the things I did struggle with in Sylvia's Lovers is the dialogue, more specifically the dialect. Almost all the characters in Sylvia's Lovers speak in a fairly strong dialect, which Elizabeth Gaskell writes out, and it does make some of the dialogue a bit hard to follow, especially because one of the things I love about Elizabeth Gaskell so much is her dialogue. That did make it much harder for me to get into. I did get used to it the more the book went on, but I think it might be one of those Elizabeth Gaskells that might be well read on audiobook. And the other thing I will say about Sylvia's Lovers, which I think is another reason why it took me a bit longer to get into, is that the book isn't really about Sylvia, it is about Sylvia's lovers. And although you do follow Sylvia through a lot of the book, you don't get to see inside her head that much, and you never really get to know her. And I think that's part of the point, and that's part of the reason why it's called Sylvia's Lovers, because actually the book is more about Philip than it is about Sylvia. But you kind of expect it to be more about Sylvia than it is, and although we follow her a lot, we don't get to see inside her head, we don't get that close look at her, and I don't at all feel the kind of bond and engagement with Sylvia as I do with a character like Molly in Wives and Daughters or Margaret in North and South. Sylvia is not exactly the heroine of Sylvia's Lovers, and for me it's more a book about Philip. And I think that's worth knowing going into it, because I think if you're expecting Sylvia to be the kind of heroine that you get in other Elizabeth Gaskell novels that you can really connect with, she isn't, and you do have this kind of distance from her throughout the book. Regardless, I do think Sylvia's Lovers is a brilliant book. It's really interesting, and if you read a few other Gaskells, I would highly recommend it. I also love the historical framing of it. I think it's set at a really interesting point in British history and really looks very interestingly at things like the press gangs. Also, the plot is brilliant, and the further you get through it, the more engaging and amazing it is. All in all, I would highly recommend Sylvia's Lovers. It is a very good Gaskell read. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments if you have read Sylvia's Lovers and what you thought of it, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk about another Gaskell book.